Before I introduce her, I want to say a few other things. First, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Arts and Humanities Division and English Department for supporting the Visiting Writers Series. There will be 2 more readings this semester. On Tuesday, March 24th, Andy Grisidich and Steve Tim, Kenosha native. I think the first Kenosha native that we've had, which will be really exciting. Or second, I should say. And then on April 21st, David Abel. And both readings are in this room, but at our normal time of 6 p.m. Today's reader, Andrea Rexilius, who comes to us from Denver, although she grew up in the area, as references to the Fox River and other things we'll tell you in this book, is the author of Sister Urn, most recently from Sidebrow Books in 2019, also New Organism, Essais from Letter Machine in 2014, Half of What They Carried Flew Away, Letter Machine 2012, and To Be Human is to Be a Conversation, which might be the title that I have cited most often to other people as a sort of thing in itself. I love that title. From Rescue Press in 2011, which she read from then when that book came out, now almost 10 years ago. She's core faculty in poetry and program coordinator for the Low-Residency Mile High MFA in creative writing at Regis University, and also teaches in the Poetry Collective at Lighthouse Writers Workshop in Denver, Colorado. So that's the part I wrote down. I was telling Andrea that I read, having read around in the book the way one does, yesterday I sat down and read it sort of straight through, and had a somewhat different experience. And the experience was something like an experience I had later in the day when I went out in the snowstorm in Madison and skied across the lake. And as we were leaving the shore behind us was very visible and articulated in its trees and houses and things. And the far shore was a very small, dark band and 2 very sort of bright, white-gray bands. And then at some point, that reversed. And in a way, that was my experience of reading the book, that there was this sense of the shifting clarity through motion that happens. So rather than, say, a series of ambiguities and complexities that remained in kind of constant struggle, I had more a sense of these shifting clarities that move through time and reappear as clarities in the book's sort of loopings and stitchings. And I really loved that sort of physical sense of reading a book and moving through it that came to me. And the thing, a passage in an essay called The Avoidance of Love by Stanley Cavell, a famous essay he wrote about King Lear, came to mind also at the beginning when he talks about poetry and how one might pay attention to it. And this is in the context of trying to dissolve the tension between paying attention to character and paying attention to patterns of words. So, for instance, you're reading Shakespeare. Oh, can we talk about King Lear as a person, or can we only talk about a pattern of words? And he wants to sort of bring those things back together in a certain way. So he said another mode of attention to the particular words themselves is directed to the voice which says them, and through that to the phenomenology of the straits of mind in which only those words said in that order will suffice. Here the picture is of a spiritual instant or passage for which only these words discover release, in which they mean deeply, not because they mean many things, but because they mean one thing completely. This is not necessarily a matter of better or worse, but of different modes in poetry. He goes on to say that certain kinds of reading are harder to do in the classroom, and it might be harder to find that moment when you can read the poem in that way, that you mean it then and there, that classrooms aren't always the easiest place to sort of mean a lyric in that way, that it's the only way one can say those words. But I was reminded of one of the things I love about poetry readings is we get to hear the voice in that way of somebody meaning the words. Please welcome Andrea Rexilius.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Rick, and thank you all for coming out. Hopefully my voice carries okay. It's going in and out a little bit from a cold I'm getting over. How many of you are poets? Do you write poetry as well as study it? Okay, great, a good amount. So I think what I'll do is I might read 6 to 8 poems, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of them in terms of how they were created. So I'm going to primarily read from the first half of Sister Urn, since that's the part of the book that's primarily related to the title. So the first poem, Andrea Hen, I actually, I've been trying to write more of a kind of lyric prose essay or memoir-ish kind of a style of book. And as I was doing that, I found that I'm much more suited to poetry. I couldn't remember any details about meeting my sister, what the 4th grade classroom looked like, what the name of the teacher was, and I realized that I didn't really care about those details. I cared more about the kind of emotional undercurrent of whatever that experience was versus creating a setting or character or plot. And at some point in sort of struggling through, I did everything. I wrote a kind of book-length, novel-length outline. I tried to stick to it, but every single section I wrote was very truncated. Maybe I could do 3 pages at the most of prose. And I started noticing that I didn't remember much. So this poem kind of began as me trying to write down everything that I did remember that was very sort of specific to my sister and I. And as I did that, it discovered its own form, which is how the title developed, the Andrea Hen. So I thought of it as kind of weaving the two of us together, disguising both of us. So as I disclosed information about her, I also disclosed equally difficult information about myself. And some of the things you might think belong to her experience actually belong to mine. We sort of twist and turn around one another. So Andrea Hen. Andrea and I flocked together. Andrea and I played jump rope and tetherball at recess. Andrea and I got our periods. I showed Andrea how to insert a tampon. I showed Andrea how to take a shower with me instead of with her mother. Andrea and I played by the Fox River, digging up big clamshells and drowning barnacles. Andrea and I walked down the railroad tracks to the sewage plant and climbed on a hill of shit that felt like muddy jello. Andrea and I played with her mother's Hungarian tarot cards. I bit Andrea on the back of the neck and left behind teeth marks. I dropped Andrea and she hit her head on the radiator and grew a tiny blue egg on the middle of her forehead. Andrea and I rode a yellow bicycle built for 2. Andrea was a stunt double. She always flew over the handlebars, flipped in the air, and rolled to a stop. The other Andrea was less stunt-like. She would land underneath the bike, scraped by the sidewalk and the bicycle chain. Andrea left moldy glasses of milk in our bedroom. Andrea listened to Prince and Madonna. Andrea didn't like that her mother had an accent and didn't shave her armpits. The other Andrea stayed in her room reading books. The other Andrea began huffing glue. The other Andrea almost had sex at a 7th grade orgy until Ramon Santiago's mother stormed in. Andrea and Andrea both snuck out of the house when Andrea's father shoved them into the walls. Andrea and Andrea set the kitchen floor on fire. Andrea and Andrea would spray their hands with hairspray and set their hands on fire. The 2 Andreas scared away all the boys with their twin powers and spooky Hungarian music. Andrea and Andrea practiced witchcraft. One Andrea wrote down the name of the boy she liked, rolled up the paper, tied it with string, and submerged it in a jar of water. Andrea dated a boy who made graffiti art. The other Andrea dated a boy who wore women's clothing. Andrea became homecoming queen. Andrea began getting F's in school. Andrea pierced her ears with a hot needle. Andrea began smoking cigarettes. Andrea cut her hair, long on one side, falling over her eyes, and short on the other. Andrea was a cheerleader. Andrea was suspended for selling drugs. She gave a boy a pill that made his pee turn blue. He vomited blue bile all over science class. The other Andrea went to raves. Andrea began taking acid and ecstasy. Andrea is bisexual. Andrea was good at math and drawing. The other Andrea preferred English class and performance art. The first Andrea and the second Andrea pulled stockings over their faces so they would look like androgynous muggers. When the first Andrea's father choked the second Andrea, the first Andrea kicked her father in the chest until he let go. Andrea became addicted to heroin. Andrea moved away. The Andreas reunited in high school playing badminton in PE class. "This is my sister Andrea," Andrea would say to her friends who would get upset by this duplication of Andreas. A boy claimed to have made out with one of the Andreas at a party, but he called the wrong Andrea to follow up. One of the Andreas loved a boy until he loved Ayn Rand, and she decided not to love him anymore. One Andrea became a stripper because she liked to dance and the money was good. The first Andrea shoved rum balls down the second Andrea's throat to get her drunk. Both Andreas would pee out of the second-story window of their room at night. One Andrea jumped off the roof. The other Andrea was too scared and went out the bathroom window. Andrea developed ulcers. Andrea tried to die. Early on, both of the Andreas stayed home sick and watched License to Drive and The Lost Boys. This is how one of the Andreas learned to speak English. "How could a billion Chinese people be wrong, Andrea?" Both of the Andreas were sexually assaulted. One of them was raped. Andrea enjoys watching Law & Order SVU. So does the other Andrea. Dum dum. Andrea's mother said blue-eyed people are not to be trusted, even though she has blue eyes herself. Andrea is addicted to prescription drugs and has severe anxiety. Both of the Andreas have brown eyes. The Andreas do not look alike. The Andreas are not related by blood. Both Andreas prefer orange cats because those are the colored cats they grew up with. It is rare when the Andreas talk to each other now. The Andreas like to get high together and watch thrillers on TV. They give each other pedicures and do face masks and talk about the past. If you put two Andreas in a room together, they will speak from the shock of static. Neither of the Andreas will cry about being an Andrea. If you cross an Andrea, they will squint their dark brown eyes at you until it feels like you are being punched in the face. Gravity. This is the line of outcome. Gravity of a veins collapse, or a heart giving way, paper thin, already made of ash. Afterwards, we gathered you into pails or buckets, into plastic bags tied shut with string. Skyward and across the Atlantic, I went to a place without trees, to sever your mind from mine. You were always so hungry or cold, nearly a ghost. Still, everyone will say, what was it like to lose a sister? What was it like to see her body embalmed within church walls in your hometown? The next poem is a sort of serial poem that I wrote this is the first poem I think I wrote after my sister died. And I ended up, I didn't really like the language of the poem. It felt too raw and a little bit too rough in terms of, it didn't have enough poetry in it, I suppose. So I used Google Translator to translate the English into Hungarian, and then I translated the Hungarian back into English, And I kept doing that, and then I pulled sentences that kind of worked the original language and composed the poem that way. So this is the series, Dear Andrea, I Speak in Tongues. Does anyone speak Hungarian? Okay, good. I don't either. I'm going to say a few of the words, because I might not do the best job. First letter, Showy. Sister, the selvage is a location and a pressure, almost a seam, raw in its potential untwining. You are a snow globe, a bright red, mutable desire. The city wept for days to put out your flames, dear tsunami, dear egress. A dress is a shape for housing you. A dress is inescapable concern, to be seen, to be envisioned. Sister, I saw your fame in the empty envelopes you never sent. I saw your self-edge, saw your blood-stained war you wore unravel. Dear sister, this seed place provides pressure. It is almost selling, but raw in its potential wreck. You are Snow White, a lively red, lustful desire. The city cried for days to put out its flames. Dear tsunami, dear egress, the dress is in shape to provide a home for you. This title is of inevitable concern, visible. Imagine, sister, I saw the fame in the empty envelope I never sent. I saw your edges. You saw the wars you explored. Second letter, Gaius. Below is a symbol of scripture, yet none will confess hope. You like the beast, its membrane of isms. Our paradox is not how the other body becomes its own body. That part is obvious, flesh of my skin, blood of my organ, like the relationship between consumption, posthumous consumption. Stitch, hermeneutical method, architecture, or as you dig a nest, building it. Sister, bestiary will be arrival, blood oath, building toward the egg's heat, the heat of the page. Paradoxical is not that the other body is looking for its own body, my sacred scripture, our body, not the blood of my blood, one hem, the relationship between postulate, posture, and composure. Third letter, Pegulum. I want to talk to you in her heart, to say, I'm sorry the threads are not tied. I still feel bound to me. I still keep your name in my name, hold who you are, who I am. We see the same color, and we sing the same wicked wounds. Listen to the song of the sky. You're the bird. When rain falls, I know it's here. Final letter, spirit of the calling. If I could understand what to say, I would betray the cleavage, the trophy, the corridor. Translate this item. I would be charcoal. You can shoot. You can go to the wall and leave a shadow where my breath has fallen. When you did not hear what I said I would be charcoal. Do not shy away from my back. It's small. Swallow it. Be in the glass bathroom where it melts with crystal chandeliers and tile-shaped ribbons. You're agnostic, but I love you. Hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. If you go, I'm scared. When you leave, I constrict. A hem. Stitch is hermeneutical method, an architecture, or how a nest, constructed by scavenging. Sister, bestiary's arrival, our blood oath, building toward heat of the egg. Paradox is not how another's body frames your own body. Her scripture, flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, ahem, relationship between consummate, consumption, and consume. Reservoir. Your mother told me you suffered from night terrors, and that's one of the reasons you took so many pills, an entire bottle in a week, followed by withdrawal, seizures, nausea, anxiety, insomnia, agoraphobia. I told her she was enabling you. She said she wouldn't put you out on the street, her mother and father long dead, her brothers somewhere in Hungary. I saw how the math stacked against you. Did you know you were dying? I stopped visiting after the Christmas you were strung out and set your sweater on fire reaching across a candle. You called your doctor a drug dealer. You'd pay a few hundred and he'd ask if you wanted pills. Yes, and he'd give them to you, despite the heart palpitations, despite your arms, despite your face. Your boyfriend thought you were possessed by a demon. After you died, he wouldn't leave your mother's house. She called the police to have him removed. Your night terrors entered her, and I was afraid they would enter me too. In her dream, she is naked, chasing you down a narrow street in Budapest, trying to grab your hand before you disappear around a corner with a man in a dark cloak. The night she found you, you were hunched over in the sink, your face pressed to the mirror. She could see you were no longer breathing. The last one I'm going to read is Grave, which when I normally read this in Denver, I bring a little box of these items. When I first flew out to Elgin, Illinois, which is where I grew up, to help my stepmother with the funeral arrangements, we went in my sister's room and there was this, about this size, like a high school locker safe kind of thing. And it was busted open. And I asked what was in the locker. And my stepmother and my sister's boyfriend said, oh yeah, we broke that open because we thought maybe that's where she, stashed drugs. That didn't occur to me that that's what might be in there. And they didn't find that in there, and I said, okay, well, what was in the box? And these are the items that were in there, and those were the items that I asked to keep. Also, I don't know if it resonates fully, but for me, learning what was in this locked box, especially when the people surrounding her thought drugs would be the most precious item that she would lock in the middle of her room, and actually it was these other things. It felt like it was sort of like her inner self that she protected in this space. So, Grave. My sister kept in a padlocked box the following items: a photo of her parents on their wedding day, Hungarian coins and bills, a ponytail of her hair tied with a blue ribbon, burlesque matchboxes, letters from her ex-girlfriend Callie, the same girlfriend who got her hooked on heroin when she was 19 years old, middle school photos of herself as a cheerleader, a purple pouch full of polished stones, the deck of Hungarian tarot cards we played with when we were young, 38 pictures of kittens. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was beautiful. So we'll take a short break now, and then the people in my class, and then anyone who would like to is welcome to stay for a conversation about poetry, about these poems, and related things. So please stay if you'd like. Have a cookie and some hot chocolate and some water. and let that sink in a little. And yes, thank you so much. Okay, so a bunch of you, well, everybody's now heard most of the, a good portion of the first, not most of, but a portion of the first half of the book, and a lot of you have read the book, and others of you have read part of the book. What would you like to either ask or also just say? You know, you're welcome to just, if you have a thought or comment or something you noticed that you, or something you'd like to ask Andrea, or something you'd like to, yeah.
What was one of your best experiences with other Andrea?
The best experiences.
One of them. Yes, you probably have.
I think it was when we rode that yellow bicycle. We really did ride a yellow bicycle built for two, a tandem bike. And I was the one that was on the front. She was on the back. So the two Andreas would be riding down the biggest hill in Elgin. We'd go as fast as we could toward the train tracks, and then we'd try to turn before we hit the train tracks, and we'd be going so fast our feet would not be able to stay on the pedals, and we'd barrel through bushes and people's yards, and that was very fun. So, yeah.
I'm more on the composition end of things. How do you pick your line breaks? Like, I was especially thinking about in the nested mammals, it's called the second half of Sister and where it just fills up the whole thing. Like, how do you pick your line breaks there?
Yeah, in Nests of Mammals, I actually didn't think of those as, I didn't pick line breaks. It was just however it laid out on the page. So it shifted from how I had it in manuscript form to how it went in the book. And they asked me, you know, some of the lines have shifted, is that okay? I was like, that's fine, because it's sort of meant to be a little bit more of a run-on kind of prose poem than something that's doing line breaks.
I'm just gonna, I think people can hear you, but I was thinking if your voice, if you feel like talking softer, you can always use this microphone, which conveniently can sit in there.
Okay, great.
And we can turn on if you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Okay. So if you feel like you want to talk softer,
yeah, so I don't have to
take the microphone. Yeah, actually, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up question, which Lisa and I were just noticing that it's right and left justified in the second section, which, you know, so that it somehow, you know, so she said, well, why is this, things aren't usually right justified, are they? And I noticed it was both, and I said, I don't know, I guess it looks a little less like, it somehow finds some in-between. It doesn't really look like prose usually looks,
and
but it also doesn't quite look like, and it definitely has those couplets sort of thing working. So what was that a very, like, how did you arrive at that look, that layout on the page?
Well, I was thinking about the couplets because you know, in part I was trying to sort of give a visual sense of the two Andreas moving through even the second section where it's less about that, but it does enter in a little bit. And I was thinking about those lines more as threads, or, you know, thinking of the sentence or a poetic line as a thread. And so it's called Nests of Mammals. The mammals would be my sister and I, Eric, whoever else is kind of mentioned in that. It's because it's sort of a family history in a way, or it's a little bit more of a straightforward kind of, that may not seem straightforward to you, but to me it's pretty straightforward, a narrative in that it's about like me going to the Natural History Museum with my husband and like thinking about things in real time. It's my actual thoughts rather than kind of poetic fragment or like it's just a different mode of writing. But the nest, I was thinking about formally, like what would it look like to kind of use the nest as a form. And so I wanted those threads, like so you see the sort of element of the different things that are woven together in the nest, which is sometimes literally thread or branches from various places or pieces of clothing, so that you got the sense of it being a woven structure, not just a linear structure or just a prose. Yes.
So first I want to say thank you for coming and for sharing. I definitely feel heavier, and it's almost like the space feels like maybe it's not big enough to hold all that, but here we are and we're in it. I guess in terms of something I'm curious about that you had touched on briefly is kind of this balance between capturing experiences that are very raw and real, but also kind of having them be poetic. So I'm curious about how you go about that.
That's a really good question. I think it varies poem to poem, but in general, I'd say, is this thing on?
It'll only work if you take it off.
Oh, okay.
It keeps collapsing. There,
Yeah,
you
okay,
can go
great.
full overdrive.
Oh, right. I think you have to pay attention to how the language works. You know, you have to do something to the syntax or the rhythm, the cadence, and follow it more rhythmically than you would normally, you know, straightforwardly dictate your life experience. You have to combine that with music. So if that makes sense. And how you do that, I don't know. I think you begin paying attention to the words, the sounds of the words, and you let yourself kind of follow maybe somewhat some of the logical narrative structure, but you also follow associative music, alliteration, that kind of thing, and you let the words sort of spawn other words that sound like them or react to them, and construct kind of in two modes simultaneously. Or use Google Translator. Use any language, see what happens. You'll get a strange sentence. Yeah.
So in that last explanation, you were talking about music. What do you mean in that sense with the, because like this isn't, you know, pitched or anything like that. So like what do you mean by music in this sense?
You didn't hear the music? The rhythm of the language, it has I think it's the cadence of it, the way it lilts, or I'm not really a prosody kind of a person, but I imagine that some of the lines do have like spondy, or you know, just you're listening to the rise and fall of how the music of the words plays out. I compose a lot by ear, I suppose. So when I'm revising, I read the poems out loud, and that lets me hear where to remove often smaller words like to or the, that kind of that adds some weight to the music of the line that doesn't need to be there. Yeah. Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay. You.
In some of your poems, you repeated the word hydrogen, and then I think in one you mentioned carbon. Is there a reason for that? Or is that just a Google Translate thing?
That one actually is secretly a very old poem that I might have written when I was about 20 years old. The first version of it, and I did put it in Google Translator, but I think that why did hydrogen? I must have been thinking about the periodic table. You know, I sort of try to have multiple influences as I'm composing a poem, so that it's not just about one specific thing. The aboutness I kind of want to arise from the language of the poem. So I like to have 2 or 3 variables that I'm kind of colliding against one another when I'm composing. So I probably was reading something about the periodic table for whatever reason, and allowed that language to kind of collide with this language about the hallway in the room and that kind of thing, which was just sort of, it's not a specific place that I had in mind, but after my sister passed away, I was looking at some of the older poems and hearing them in a different way. And she died in a bathroom. There wasn't a chandelier in there, but she would have wanted one to be there. So it sort of just took on that space of belonging to her story. And I think hydrogen, that feels like a sort of, like you're gasping for breath, I don't know. But it's sort of both a kind of calling out to her and her sort of calling out at the same time. So it's a little inexact the way that poem developed. Yes?
I was going to ask, since you were talking about kind of trying to ensure that your poems had a rhythm and a deeper feel to them, do you think that trying to, I guess, work around that ever distracts from getting across your idea as directly and how you meant it as possible? If that makes sense.
Well, what I try to do is have enough variety, like in a manuscript, in a collection, that there are landing places, and there are some poems that sort of reveal more about where we're oriented in time and space. And so the book is about my sister and my relationship with my sister. You pretty much know what happened to her, quite a lot about our childhood. So when we get to the poems that are a little bit more obscured by the Google Translator, those should be kind of maybe emotionally interacting with the pieces that have more like logical or intellectual or narrative signposts. So I try to have enough variety that one poem might help you enter a different poem that feels more difficult to enter. Does that make sense? So maybe some of the poems, I think are harder to enter, but if you put them next to one that's easier to enter, they're speaking to each other too. So hopefully you sort of hear them in a conversation with one another as well. So. I do, though, think each poem gives you information about how to read it. So let's say you didn't have the full book and you tried to read, Dear Andrea, I Speak in Tongues. I Speak in Tongues gives quite a bit of information about the fact that it's not going to be the most straightforward. It's going to kind of come in and out of a clarity. And that's part of the meaning that it's making. Yes?
Why do you think this is the case?
What is the case?
That just reading the poem would be more exciting than having understand. We were just talking about.
Well, I think when a poem's successful, it does that. It teaches you how to read it. So, poems started out being pretty rigid in terms of their form, so now I'm not a traditional writer. I'm not writing sonnets and sestinas. I'm not thinking about music in that way. I'm doing a different kind of patterning. And since I'm using free verse and I'm a little bit more of an experimental writer, I'm like, each poem I'm developing a form or a pattern. Form is basically pattern. So there's always some information in that poem that teaches you what the structure, the pattern of that poem is. Or there's language like across the manuscript, so all the hems and the stitches and the nests are things that are sort of signaling to you formally, structurally, how you might begin to think about what kind of form I'm using. But every contemporary poet or book of poems kind of reinvents form or pattern. So when you read poetry, you've got to, you have to look for those kind of architectural cues, structural language, so that you see how to unfold that poem so that you get the most meaning out of it. Yeah.
In my, I guess, personal experience, a lot of poetry comes from, I guess, a way of coping and exploring an idea and a feeling through yourself to kind of reach a resolution or get over that feeling, if that's what you're trying to do. Did you feel that through composing this book you were more resolved with your feelings, or felt more comfortable, or were less, I guess, sad about the loss of a sister?
Yeah, that's sort of a twofold question because, I mean, definitely, yes. I felt that for me, writing is a way of kind of thinking through something, or maybe even figuring out what I think or feel maybe is the stronger thing that happens, is it's about the feeling. Because that's more of what gets revealed to me. I already maybe know what I think in various ways, and so I'm trying to not just say what I already know and what I already think, but I'm trying to use the writing to uncover some meaning that's still kind of hidden or obscured to me, which is why sometimes maybe the language goes a little bit more into an abstract or less clear realm, because I think that's where it reaches into the subconscious and shows me something as well. So I definitely feel it's kind of contained in a way, those emotions and thoughts, and it feels nice to have a sort of physical memorial for my sister. I titled the book Sister Urn so that the book itself was the urn. It's the container of the ashes. But now that the book is out, I have to say it's not the easiest thing to read from. I feel like I have enough distance that I have to sort of be present with the language, but distance myself enough so that I don't have thoughts in the moment about what I'm reading. I had early on when the book came out, when I had the box of items, I could barely get through the last poem. I was just like crying on the stage, and because in that moment as I was reading the last poem, rather than sort of vacating myself to just read what was on the page, I had a thought, and it was, my sister's dead. And then I just sort of lost it in the present moment on the stage. So in that sense, it's a little harder. I cannot wait until I write another new book so that I can read from that instead. But I think it's nice to sort of invoke my sister into various spaces for a little while. So, yeah.
So speaking of new books and like less emotionally weighted things, what was the publishing process like?
Well, what do you, like from start to finish?
Yeah,
kind
I mean, it's just like a very obviously like important topic to you. So, like,
yeah.
How was it like, kind of like submitting that to someone else and having them get like be like? How was that for you?
Yeah, that's actually they did submit a few edits, and I had a great editor who was a really, careful, intelligent reader, and so the notes that they gave me were really useful to sort of re-engage with the book. What ended up happening is that there were a couple of poems that they wanted me to kind of press on further, and I was able to do that with some, and I think with one of them I was like, I can't re-enter this poem, I'm just going to scrap it. And then I wrote the Reservoir poem, which is the prose piece that kind of gives some more of the kind of narrative detail to anchor the more lyric pieces. And I'm really glad that they kind of prompted me in a way to write that poem. I think it was really a good piece to have in there. So I think that, you know, maybe part of what you're asking is about like when you've written something that's pretty close to you and like a sensitive topic, how do you react to somebody critiquing it, or you know? I think I've come to a place where I feel primarily like in collaboration with the writing, so it feels very personal. It feels deeply personal, but I also feel like I can look at it as an object, as an art object, and think about how it's balanced in terms of its pattern or its music, like I'm doing a painting, you know, and if there's somebody looks at it and they're like, it's sort of like lopsided, you know, I'm not going to throw a fit about it. I'll be like, oh, you're right, like how can I balance that? So I'm able to have a kind of distance with the poem as an art object that I can fine tune. And, you know, editors are pretty good. You can always be like, nope, you know, I mean, some of them, not all, but usually the poetry, we're on small presses, so the people are pretty down to earth. So, yeah, it was actually a really good experience. And the cover, this is the first book, it's my 4th book, and it's the first book where I didn't have a say in the cover. They were going to choose the cover. And I sort of was okay with that. I was like, I don't know what the cover should be. I'll kind of see what they come up with. I like their covers that they do for their other books. And there was a different cover first that I actually really liked, and it was by a Hungarian artist, so I was super excited to have that one. But the artist didn't ever reply, so we ended up with this other cover, which also feels really appropriate to the book. At first, I saw it and I was like, oh my God, that cover makes me seem like I'm a witch. It was very sort of metal seeming, but now I'm into that.
I want to kind of follow up on some various threads that people have mentioned, which is a thing I was noticing in reading the book, was this kind of shifting between sort of the thing acting and the thing being acted upon. So like the thread and the beak of the bird seem to switch places, and it's like the sentence at some point is is unraveling the thread, and at some other point it is the thread that's being raveled in.
Right.
And I'm also looking at like thinking about that sense of like getting across your meaning as if you were in some way outside the poem, but then the poet as bacterium or microcosm as if like it's more that you're the petri dish in which this thing is happening, or something like that. But thinking about that sense of like, it seems like something that you're constantly shifting that locus of control. So at one point you said it was too raw, and then you do this other thing to it, but then it also sounds like the things you do to it in another way make them less organized or less in your control in a certain way. So yeah, I don't know if there's something there that you can talk about your relationship to control and to sort of what, like finding something you're confident can move you beyond this place that you are, a practice or something that it seems like there's various practices you have confidence in even though you don't know what's going to emerge.
Right.
Or something like that. A lot of questions at once, but particularly that thing of the line, I was fascinated by.
Yeah, well, in the nests of mammals, and that's sort of a different beast. It's a totally different form that's happening. I think of it kind of as a long poem. I also think of it as a poem essay, which it says both in there. So that's one of my sort of like nods for here's some of the structure. It's a poem and it's an essay. So what does that mean? Because it's an essay, it meant that I was sort of, I guess whenever I would restart, the language, the images, the ideas that had already begun accumulating in nests of mammals is where I would pick up. So they might change positions, or I might think about how they warp or extend or swap places, or like, I'm trying to think too maybe about like multiplicity in various ways, how an image might have multiple meanings in a piece. So the thread kind of is a bunch of different things. It's the sentence, it's the thing in the bird's beak, it's the line, it's the, and the hem turns into like a hemisphere and hemoglobin. So it's partially etymological, thinking about relationships between words, and then it's partially like what are the different ways that the image might move, so that it's not a static thing each time it appears, but it's changing and it's sort of transforming the way that the poem is as well. With Nests of Mammals, I was just kind of I was sort of trying to enter more of a space where I was less in control of what I was thinking about, and I was just walking around, going to the Botanic Gardens, reading various books, looking at the Natural History Museum, gathering up these images and ideas, and then kind of seeing what they had to say to each other. So I wanted to enter maybe a little bit more of a subconscious space where the language directed itself a bit more, and I think it does. I don't know. You have your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have a question in the back, or since Joe's had a few questions? No. Lexington, do you have a question? No. Okay. Thomas, did you?
I can if I have to.
No, go ahead, Joe. If you've got a question that you could, there was.
So you started talking about multiplicity and stuff like that. The class that we're doing, one of Rick's classes, is the What is Poetry thing. And it's kind of a bit of an exposition thing. It's in my mind tied to this thing I'm learning about in music history right now, about how there was this debate in the 19th century between music, like that is pure music, like for the sake of music, music being musical because it's music, or music where the composer is like saying this is about a witch's Sabbath or things like that, and we got really heated in the 19th century. I'm like 90% sure Wagner and Brahms were not into a fist fight, but so I'm thinking about how that applies to poetry and the same idea of things like. So it's kind of a philosophical question. How do you feel about that? Like, are poems supposed to have one explicit meaning, like decided by the poet, or is it supposed to be something that goes into this space where other people can interpret it, have their own meanings for it, things like that?
I'm definitely more on the side of forms being more open. So I don't necessarily think that they can be just wildly interpreted any old way by various people, but that there are multiple ways to interpret a poem. My preference is for a poem to have, in my reading habits and my writing habits, my preference is for me to be able to come to a poem many different times and each time come away with maybe a new impression or experience of the poem. I think of it also as experiential, like you're not outside of a poem when you read it or hear it, you engage with it. It's a conversation you have with the poem. It's not a dead object. You have to breathe it into you and speak it through your own breath and inhabit it and be inhabited by it in order to really experience it. And that's my preference. I don't like poems that where I feel like I can just glance at it and be like, I know what that means, whatever, and then what? Do I read it again over and over, and have the same experience? I like to sort of work. So in terms of another art form, my preference would be And not that I like all abstract paintings, but I'm definitely more into abstract expressionism. And what is that? That's more experiential too. You know, you don't look at a Jackson Pollock, who is not my favorite, by the way, he just came to my mind. But you don't look at a Jackson Pollock and think, what does it mean? You feel something when you look at it, and you think about the movement of it and the colors, and that has meaning. You don't have to be able to, you know, write. You can write an essay about a Jackson Pollock's meaning, but it's maybe not going to be, you know, it's about a 19th century picnic, and you know, where it's a kind of one-to-one correlation in meaning. I like to discover meaning a little bit more. So, yes.
Just a few simple questions, I guess. Do you daily write? Or write daily?
Okay, so my writing practice. I do not write daily. I tend to write because I have a busy schedule and I'm not a morning person, I'm a night person, and I really shouldn't be. I do have to get up in the morning. So I'm usually just laying in the bed. I should probably write at night. Just embrace my natural schedule, but then I'd be late for work. So I usually write on Fridays or on the weekends when I have a little bit of free time. And I sometimes write in spurts just because of the nature of my schedule again. So like during a winter break or summer break, when I have maybe a few days or a week to myself, I'll do quite a lot of writing then. And I sort of plant a seed for what I'm thinking about or beginning, and then I'm able to return to it much, much easier. I also tend to write more, like I think more about a full collection, a manuscript, because I like to think about that I'm always creating a kind of long project or an essay that's also poetry. So, and then I'm like putting these different elements in conversation with one another rather than writing like one poem, one poem, one poem. They're always kind of speaking to the previous poems I've written. In part, that's like a shorthand so that it's easier to gather it into a manuscript, and it's also in part so that it's easier for me to return to it when I have time to return to what I'm working on. It's part of an ongoing conversation rather than like a fresh thing that I'm coming up with.
For you, what's the hardest part about writing?
The hardest part, I think, is trying to write when you're not thinking about anything. You have to have some stuff that some grit or something that you're turning over in your mind. Even just an image, some books that you're reading at the same time. Nonfiction is very helpful. I love revising. I feel like that's the easiest part. I love to already have something on the page that I can carve out and fine tune. The hardest part is figuring out, like, do I have anything else to say? What am I thinking about? And usually when I am starting a new project, I'll sort of ask, like, okay, so what am I doing? What am I thinking about? What am I watching? What am I looking at? And I try to always be kind of feeding myself artistically, so I go to museums all the time. I like go to the library and get lots of books. So then I just look at what those things actually are, and allow those to become what the poems are made out of. So the Natural History Museum, my sister, the election, the news. That's myths and mammals. So, yeah. 3 hands. Okay, you?
I was just wondering how you decide when a poem is final. Because with this whole like Google Translate effect, it feels like some of these poems you could keep reworking and rewriting forever, keep plugging them into Google Translate. So I was wondering how you get to that stopping point, or if you consider these poems to be final, if there's a stopping point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's when I'm revising. I don't Google Translate all my poems. I only did it for the one, and then I just wrote the other ones from combination of things people say and images and stuff like that. But for any poem that I'm writing, it is about like how the line sounds, I want each line to be interesting and unusual or like fresh sounding. I carve back quite a bit. So in Nests and Mammals, I was initially trying to give myself the constraint of filling an entire page each time I wrote. And in part, that's how it spaced out into couplets. So I was like, I ran out of steam, or, it's long enough, it's very long. So I kind of spaced it out, and then I preferred that spacing, in part because of how it interacted with the meaning of Nests and Mammals. And so whatever pages are shorter, it's because when I was revising, I just took away anything that I couldn't. Sometimes when I'm revising, it's to clarify a line, and sometimes that just doesn't work, and it just gets murkier and murkier, and then I just carve it away. I learned that lesson from a lemon tree that I had, where I wasn't pruning the branches, and I went out one day and was like, there's all these dead branches on the tips, and it stopped flowering, stopped producing lemons, so I pruned the whole thing pretty excessively, and then it became beautiful. And I was like, that's what you have to do with poems. Just don't be afraid to prune them, because you get rid of things and new things arise, or it makes space for new language to inhabit that, or things can just be shorter if that's what they want. So I cut things back quite a bit, and I read it out loud to hear the rhythm of it, but also to kind of get a sense of if the line is interesting or not. So.
Yeah, I have a good friend who has an apple orchard, and the way he talks about pruning is, which is, once you hear it, is really obvious, is what you're doing is allowing light to reach as much of the tree as possible. Right, so it's not, part of it is about having fewer fruit buds so that more energy goes to them, you get bigger fruit, but it's also like sort of allowing. So it's interesting to think of, like when you're cutting a poem down, it's not just about removing something, it's also about allowing something in, and which, thinking about that analogy, and allowing something in that's not that's not present in the page directly in some way. And that's another thing that that space between things can do. If those gaps are, different connections get made and different things grow maybe in the space when there's something allowed.
Yeah, I find those places to prune by noticing where I'm like, that'll do. Nobody's said anything about that line, but there's something about it that kind of makes me cringe or feel like embarrassed by it, or like it's not, and I feel like we all do that, where we sort of have these lines that we're like, that'll pass, nobody's gonna mention it, and so I try to just face those at some point and be like, what is it about that part of the poem that makes me sort of like, I don't want to read that out loud to anybody, and have them hear me read it. So I try to examine that and see like, okay, is it, it's a little too much like a regular prose sentence? Am I repeating something? Is it just like a really, sometimes I'm paying attention to language, sometimes I'm paying attention to image. So I'm trying to strike the right balance. Like if an image, like the, dear tsunami, dear egress, and then I move to address, that's very like sound-based composition. and my sister is a bit like a tsunami, you know, or egress, so it's kind of descriptive of her. But other times I'm trying to clarify an image where I'm like, I don't like this line because it's how are you supposed to visualize this? It's like a murky metaphor, so then I'll try to clarify that or cut it back. And you'd be surprised when you cut things back what kind of shift takes place from the line that is the two lines that are left. There's often like a remarkable, you're like, oh my God, why did I look at this line, try to revise it for so long? It just shouldn't have been there. It's amazing what happens without it in terms of how those two lines speak to each other. I also sort of sometimes rearrange language. So if I have a stanza, I'll notice what words I'm using, and if I don't like one of the lines, I'll see, what if I pulled this word up here and move this one down here? So I just sort of see with that language that's present, can something else happen that changes the poem in an interesting way? Oh, yes.
I hope this is less of an observation and more of like an open-ended statement-ish. But like what you were talking about kind of made me think of a few other things that I've heard from authors, such as Hemingway's iceberg theory, and how he believes that what you put into your book at face level should be much less than what you've actually thought through, and all the details you want there, but they don't actually show.
Mm-hmm.
And that also led me to think about what J.K. Rowling says about how you should know so many more details about, or how she knew so many more details about Harry Potter than the readers will ever know.
Mm-hmm.
And with what you just said, it kind of made me think that every time you take out your own interpretations and the way you look at your story, you're kind of building a space for the reader to come in and see the story and learn with it and move with it.
Yeah, and well, you take out some of the explanation, you know, I think the reason that I like to let go of the reins so much is that once you kind of know what you want to say or what you are saying, it becomes very dogmatic or heavy-handed, or it's too explanatory. You're just explaining and you shut down the other meanings. So if you keep yourself a little bit writing from, you know, the back of your brain and the front, something invisible to you comes out on the page, and that's the part where it becomes most powerful. And you can shape that. It's not that you keep yourself in the dark entirely, but you begin to notice the patterns, the structural language, the kind of clues that maybe the subconscious is giving you, and you carve it out, sharpen it a little bit more without explaining it. It explains itself through symbolism or through repetition, through the tone, the emotion of it. So.
Yeah, I would add, thinking about like when the poet steps back or the writer steps back in some way, it's not just the reader that comes in. Like before there's ever a reader or a reader other than you, it's like the language comes in, the world comes in. You know, when we're talking about observations in class, in my first class, if you're saying, you know, if you're always saying what you think is you see, by eliminating what you think, you might start to see what's there. And I think that happens a lot with one's own writing. Like you think you know what you're writing, or you think you know what the writing is doing. But a lot of the stuff you can let go of is the things that you're sort of thinking that are getting in the way of these other things that you're also thinking and that the language is doing and that's happening there. So it's like a process of finding out what you know about what you've written and what you think you've written, and you know, that happens in the present. Mm-hmm. And the thing that you're letting go of often is the thing that you used to think, or you thought you thought the poem was this, and it can be hard to like come into the present with your writing. Like you can be attached to the thing that you were thinking about when you first started writing it, or something like that. and cling to that when the poem has gone on, like the language has gone on and into the stayed in the present, and you're keep trying to go back to the past, and sometimes maybe it takes 20 years, like you said about that one poem, and then you're like,
Right.
oh, now this thing can be alive in a way that I maybe had no idea what I was doing when I first wrote it or something.
Right, yeah.
So I think,
I think the hard part of it is that you do have to just take kind of a leap of faith off a cliff into the abyss of, learning how to navigate in this new way and trusting that navigation, and definitely reading lots of poetry, especially poetry that you find difficult, can help you do that, because once you begin to learn how to navigate through a variety of styles of poems, you kind of intuitively pick up on those skills as a writer. You just start doing them. So.
And I think it's also, like, thinking about that, the verb is what's so important. Like, sometimes we think of reading a poem, Andrea didn't say you need to be able to understand all these poems. You have to navigate through them, right? So if you, kayak down a river full of rapids, you're not going to like understand everything about the river, but you might be able to enjoy an experience going through it in some really intense way. And that's what a lot of reading is like, that you navigate your way through it, and it's like the more comfortable you get with what it's like to read, the less you need to know at every moment. Like, you keep wanting to stop, but the thing is just insistently moving if it's really alive. So it might be a different experience of what it means to navigate through something than to at every moment be able to stop and sort of have a complete control of whatever you're reading. The reader also has to release something maybe. And then you can, there's more pleasure in a certain way and more excitement.
Something else.
Follow up.
If anyone wants to ask questions, I'm not trying to be the only one, but to go off of what you were just saying, the metaphor you were using about going down a stream, and this is kind of directed towards you, I guess. Would you think that part of, taking out the rocks or the parts that get in the way of you navigating the stream would also be removing taxing language that is hard to, that doesn't flow off the tongue and doesn't digest easily?
I think I like the rocks. I'm trying to continue our metaphor. Think about, poems that are like going down rapids versus poems that are, both actually seem quite nice. The canoe ride. Either way, I suppose there's a kind of depth and unseen quality below. But I think the rocks can actually be good.
Or an absolutely still surface that doesn't, that's not moving at all. But I think poems slow you down often. They don't just speed you up. And they don't, when you talk about flow, one thing flow does in a poem is force you to slow down and say oh, I thought that it was going to be this word, but it was this other word, and now what do I do? And suddenly I see the word. We talked about this in one class the other day, I forget which one, about, when it's a little bit not the word you thought it was. And that Ashbreak poem we were reading after For John Clare, right, where it was oh, it seems like it's going to say this, but it actually says this slightly different thing. And so all of a sudden you see it in a way you wouldn't have seen it before.
Yeah, I think one thing to point out is that for me, writing and reading poetry is all about shifting perception and perspective. So I think I like to read a poem that is more surprising to me in that kind of way, because it kind of wakes you up, or it makes you think about something in a new way, which is also, to come back to Jackson Pollock, it's about a perceptual shift in thinking about, different ways that you can express with paint. There was just a Monet exhibit in Denver. Monet I think of as fairly regular at this point. You know, you can see the image of the bridge, but it's all the impressionist pointillist painting. And when I was looking at those, I thought, okay, they're kind of just landscape paintings, but what he did is think about the light and how the light interacts with the paint, and it's less like you're looking at a photograph where you have the regular kind of paint strokes where it looks more like a lacquer and it looks more like a photograph of a scene or landscape. This brings landscape to where you feel like you're actually looking at the scene as you look at the painting, because it has a sort of blurriness to it. It has a kind of inexactness that makes it even more exact experientially. It's less of a sort of veneer or illusion, and it's more of an actual interaction that takes place. So, you know, you can think about, your poetry doesn't have to be Jackson Pollock, it could be Monet. You know? It's still sort of playing around with how you shift perception or perspective, and how you think about the experiential quality of poetry, but it doesn't have to be fully, you know, like Zukofsky or something like that.
I think this is a good place to stop. We've made Andrea talk for a really long time, so please thank her for doing this. Yeah, thanks everybody for staying and your attention, and I'll see a lot of you on Thursday.